Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature. Today's topic, Rethinking Wolves, Changing Our Perception of Predators, presented by Expedition Leader Aaron Bott. I'm Rob Mess. Thank you so much for being here with us today. Aaron, take it away.
Thank you. Thanks everyone for tuning in today. I'm very excited to be presenting on wolves and wolf history, the scientific history of our knowledge and understanding of these charismatic animals. Um, yeah, hopefully everyone will be able to at least walk away from this presentation having learned something new. And like Rob said at the end of the presentation, there will be a Q&A, and I hope to get to all of your questions and provide some answers. I'm very grateful that we have this opportunity to engage and learn from one another through webinars. However, it's always a bit of a pity that we're not together in a room and we can engage more personally. Nevertheless, here we go. As Rob introduced me, my name is Aaron Bott. I am a wolf biologist. I have been studying and researching wolves all across the American West for a number of years. Um, my job is to not only monitor wolf populations in the West and understand their biology and their ecology, but I also research and study their social behavior and their predation patterns, and I work to mitigate conflicts with livestock, livestock and with humans. Um, this opening image that I have here is a picture of myself performing one of the more interesting parts of my profession, which is to capture wolves and monitor their health and their overall fitness by taking blood samples, biopsies, measuring heart rates, sex, overall body condition, and then outfitting wolves with radio collars in order to understand their movements on the landscape. So the wolf that I have in this picture, some people have asked me, is it dead? Is it hurt? Nope, it's very much alive. It's just been anesthetized. So it's sleeping, and we're taking it to a location where we can more comfortably outfit the animal, again, with one of those radio collars. Today's presentation is specifically about how our understanding of wolves has evolved over the last approximately 100 years. I've given a number of webinar presentations for natural habitat adventures. A lot of them have been on wolves because wolves are my specialty. I've talked about wolf social behavior, wolf predation patterns, the history of wolf recovery in specific areas of North America. But today we're going to be talking about what we've learned about wolves in the last 100 years. And I'm going to be highlighting some seminal landmarks about our understanding of wolves and how it's transformed and metamorphized over the last several decades even. I'll get into the weeds of this a little bit more, but it needs to be said that wolves are one of the most, if not the most studied wild animal on the planet. And they have a tremendous geographic range all across the Northern Hemisphere. And so there's no way that I could possibly do justice to everyone who has worked on wolf biology all across the world to help advance our understanding of this very complex and interesting species. So unfortunately, I'm going to be just highlighting a couple of what I think are some of the most important elements, or again, monumental moments or characters in our understanding of wolf science and biology. But please understand that, again, a lot of people, hundreds of people all over the world have been really working diligently to advance our understanding of this animal and how they fit into the ecosystem. So this is just kind of a crash course. I hope that you're all curious enough to go off and do some more research on your own afterwards. I like to begin with this fantastic photograph taken by a friend of mine, Ronan Donovan, up in Yellowstone National Park. and begin with this quote by Aldo Leopold. Aldo Leopold, we'll be talking about him more in a little bit. He's considered to be the father of modern wildlife management and biology. And he famously said, "Only the mountain has lived long enough to listen objectively to the howl of the wolf." I love that quote because humans are a very emotionally driven species. We are intelligent, but I think what really makes us unique is how powerful our emotions are, and the fact that we like to generate stories to help our understanding of the world and the universe. And for many of us, wolves are characters in our stories, either for good or for ill. And it's difficult even as a scientist, as I try and penetrate through all of the social baggage that we humans have heaped on the back of the wolf over centuries and even millennia. As much as I want to get at the root of the wolf and understanding its biology and its anatomy and behavior and ecology, even I can't help but be swept up sometimes with the emotional fervor that comes with the wolf. Again, a lot of people find them to be noble and majestic. A lot of people find them to be loathsome and destructive. And there's very few people who are apathetic about wolves. Perhaps, as Aldo Leopold says, only the mountain has lived long enough to objectively listen to the howl of a wolf. So that'll help us as we dive into our evolving understanding of wolves and our relationships with wolves. Before we get into the scientific revolution regarding wolf biology, I think we need to take just a minute and understand a little bit about the biology through a historical perspective, an evolutionary perspective about these animals. The wolf is commonly called the gray wolf, but it's also known as the timber wolf. In some places, it's an Arctic wolf or a Mexican gray wolf. But the genus and the species of this animal is Canis lupus. And its evolutionary history can be traced back clear into the Pliocene and then more predominantly in the Pleistocene or the Ice Age. And it was during this time that the gray wolf was navigating a very complex landscape that was dominated by much larger carnivores. Today, we think of wolves as being apex predators, but in terms of their evolutionary past, wolves were not the top dogs. They shared a complex landscape across the northern hemisphere with much larger predators and carnivores, such as in this picture, we have gray wolves getting tangled with their now extinct relative, the dire wolf, in this illustration by Mauricio Anton. Wolves were, you could pretty much argue, mesocarnivores or middle-sized carnivores. They were trying to adapt to a hyper-competitive landscape where you had lions, saber-toothed cats, short-faced bears, dire wolves, and a whole host of other large carnivores. And this competitive landscape helped them to evolve into becoming a highly dynamic and behaviorally fluid species on the landscape, which ultimately allowed them to dominate the entire northern hemisphere. It worked out to their benefit. Your canids all emerged historically during the Pliocene from the New World or from North America. And then during the Pleistocene, we had what's called biotic interchange, where the progenitors to the modern wolf, early canids, left North America and crossed on the Beringia land bridge into Eurasia. And there, about 800,000 years ago, we had suddenly the emergence of Canis lupus, or the gray wolf as we now recognize it as a species. And as gray wolves emerged on the Eurasian landscape, they again, because of their suitability to various complex environments, were able to spread all across Eurasia and ultimately crossed back into North America. And for tens of thousands of years, you had this biotic interchange where essentially all across the northern hemisphere, gray wolves were flexing their muscles and adapting to various habitats from the Arctic down to the deserts, and coexisting with a lot of various species, either other carnivores or other prey species. In the long run, again, evolutionarily speaking, this was fantastic for the wolf. It really helped give it an upper hand so that when the Pleistocene ended and the last glacial maximum retreated, many of the large megafaunal species that we're familiar with when we visit museums, such as short-faced bears or saber-toothed cats or dire wolves, went extinct. But because of the behavioral flexibility that wolves have, they were able to tenaciously outlast and outsurvive the competitors that they had coexisted with during the Ice Age. Here in North America, their closest living relative is the coyote or the coyote. And in the wild, they are the closest living relative to the wolf today. However, there is quite a bit of genetic divergence between the two species. Now, why I think wolves are so fascinating are for several reasons. One reason is because of their complex social behavior. But another reason is because of our complex relationship with this species. Wolves were the first animals to ever be domesticated, and this took place in Eurasia about 15,000 years ago. It's hotly debated when this took place and where this took place, if it happened just once or if it happened over multiple independent events across Eurasia. Some anthropologists and early biologists suspect that this domestication event actually took place thousands of years before the proposed 15,000 years ago. Nevertheless, at least 15,000 years ago, wolves and humans co-mingled to the point that domestication took place. This is sometimes hypothesized to be due to what we call a commensal pathway to domestication, where perhaps wolves becoming habituated over time by following nomadic human groups and scavenging off of our refuse ultimately became so habituated to humans that they lost their fear of us, and then it was only a matter of time before humans just breached that small gap, maybe took wolf pups home with them and began to tame them for multiple generations, ultimately leading to domestication. And I find this to be fascinating because I have a dog. I've got a dog here in the room with me, my German Shepherd. And her DNA is identical to the wolves that I study out in the wild. And for any of you folks back home who have dogs, whether it's a Shih Tzu or a Yorkie or a Chihuahua or a Golden Retriever, your dog's DNA is 99.9% gray wolf. It's just through artificial selection that we have had not genetic divergence, but genetic modification of the species, which is pretty remarkable. So this domestication process, again, took place a very long time ago and took place well before we ever got around to domesticating sheep, goats, cattle, horses. That massive domestication event took place around 9,000 or 10,000 years ago. So wolves have been our companions for a very long time. And even today, I find that it's rather ironic that man's best friend is also often considered to be man's worst enemy. Moving forward, this map shows the historical and the present distribution of wolves across the globe. The dark gray is approximately the current location of our wolf populations in the northern hemisphere. The mid-tone gray indicates where they historically ranged. But you can see here that really all across the northern hemisphere, at one point in time, you could find wolves, which is one reason why humans have such complex feelings about wolves. We have literally coexisted with them for tens of thousands of years in both hemispheres, the Western and the Eastern. And this is rather unique. No other species has had this great of a global distribution, with the exception of humans. I should say no other terrestrial species has had this great of a distribution, with the exception of humans. And this is really important for us to realize that for tens of thousands of years, anyone living in the northern hemisphere would have had some kind of direct relationship with wolves, some kind of indigenous connection and indigenous knowledge of wolves and their behavior. Nowadays, I feel that there's a kind of an underappreciation of just how deeply embedded wolves are into our collective cultures all across the northern hemisphere. Of course, we're familiar with the more recent Grimm's fairy tales stories about Little Red Riding Hood, and the Three Little Pigs, and other fanciful stories where the wolf is perceived to be wicked or troublesome. But for all of the cultures across the diversity of the Northern Hemisphere, indigenous peoples in Europe and in Asia, as well as in North America, had again, relationship, a deep relationship and understanding of wolves and how they fit into the ecosystem and how important they were in the ecosystem. This presentation today is mostly focused on the last 100 years, and so we're not going to be delving into some of those indigenous cultures' understandings of the importance of wolves. And we're going to skip forward again to more recent scientific discoveries. But it's important for us to highlight and understand that it's not just indigenous peoples in North America who had complex but interesting relationships with wolves. There's also indigenous peoples in Europe at one point in time, and indigenous peoples in Asia going back far enough. But everything really changed with the advent of livestock husbandry and agriculture. Humans began to, again, domesticate things like goats and sheep and horses and cattle during the agricultural revolution about 9 to 10,000 years ago. And suddenly, humanity's relationship with the natural world became very different than it had been when humans were hunters and gatherers. We had this big cultural shift where your survival now depended upon your success as an agriculturalist, as a producer of whether it be livestock for meat or for clothing, or for farming and tilling lands for vegetable produce. And this sudden divide really strained relationships between humans and large carnivores. If you are a goat herder out in Africa and you've got a leopard who's hanging around your flock of goats, it's going to be stressful, more stressful perhaps than when you're a hunter gatherer and you're out on the landscape hunting Thompson gazelle or whatever you have, and you know that there are lions and cheetahs and leopards in the bush. So this kind of tension really developed as humanity started to move towards a more agrarian lifestyle. And predators, large carnivores specifically, were often targeted for systematic and concerted removal. Again, most of my audience today, I'm assuming, is in North America, from North America. And these photographs that I'm showing you here are the most recent predator eradication efforts that took place in the United States just over a century ago. But let's remember that systematic removal of large carnivores has been taking place for thousands of years. The first documented bounty on wolves that we are aware of was recorded in the 6th century BC. Wolves were systematically eradicated from the British Isles back in the 1600s and the 1700s. They're eradicated through most of Europe, especially southern Europe in the 1700s. Japan, Mongolia, China, a lot of these places also reduced their large carnivore and wolf populations, again, over the centuries. So as unfortunate as it is, large carnivore eradication efforts are not new. They're certainly concerning now as we're beginning to understand and appreciate the complexity of large carnivores on the ecosystem, but they are not, but this systematic removal is again not a new thing. Here in the United States, just kind of as a little vignette of predator control programs, we once had wolves that ranged from the Atlantic to the Pacific and all the way from the top of the country, from Alaska, all the way down through central Mexico. But as European settlers began to colonize North America, they brought with them their culture and their tradition of agriculture and livestock husbandry. And by bringing in their cattle, their sheep, their goats, their domesticated animals with them to support themselves, to sustain themselves, and to support their economy, they had to make room for all of these domestic animals. And this making room often required the eradication of many ungulate species or hooved animal species which were native to the continent. And so we had a mass collapse in our ecosystem with the loss of bison, but also elk, deer, pronghorn, and other herbivores on the landscape. And we supplanted all of those again with millions of livestock animals. And at the turn of the century, at the end of the 1800s and early 1900s, suddenly you had an abundance of carnivores, not a lot of native prey, and depredation rates, or the consumption and attacking and killing of livestock by carnivores, was very common. And it was very concerning and problematic for people who depended upon their livestock. And so in the early 1800s, or excuse me, the early 1900s, the governments, both federal and local governments, began to initiate bounty programs to try and eliminate as many large carnivores as possible. And this practice went all the way up into the mid 1930s. And it was very successful and very quick. Whereas in Europe and in Asia, predator eradication programs had taken centuries to become successful. Here in North America, it was just a matter of decades. And the reason why we were so effective at removing large carnivores in such a short period of time was because we primarily used poison. We were using strychnine and compounds like 1080, and we were lacing meat on the landscape, and we're, again, very effective at very quickly killing off most of our large carnivores. Our wolf population all across the US basically collapsed by the 1950s. In the 1950s, you really only had a few dozen wolves in northern Minnesota on the Canadian border that were left. And during this time, human settlement had also greatly altered and radically changed the landscape. So it wasn't just the fact that large carnivores were being eliminated, it was also the altercation of the landscape, the building of metropolitan areas, establishing roadways, and the fragmentation of habitat, which really carved up and forever changed the wilderness landscape that had been the United States, and not just the United States, but into Canada and Mexico as well. So that was a lot of history that basically shows how we got to where we were 100 years ago, from indigenous understandings and appreciations, or at least complex relationships with large carnivores, to villainizing them and seeing them as, at the best, a problem economically, and at worst, villainizing them to the point that they are demonic monsters and a threat. All of this came to a head in the 1930s by a few individuals who really began to question the current status quo of eradicating large carnivores, and again, villainizing them without having a complete understanding of their role in the ecosystems and in the environment. And in the next few slides, I just want to highlight a few key individuals who I think, really helped to alter the course of history and change the way people uh, began to see their relationship with the landscape and with these large carnivores. And first and foremost, I like to present this slide on Aldo Leopold. Unfortunately, Aldo Leopold is one of the unsung heroes of wildlife biology, ecology, and conservation. Unless you're a professional wildlife ecologist or biologist, most people have never heard of Aldo Leopold. But he lived at the turn of the century, was deeply invested in land management, and questioned our relationship with the land and began to ask the hard questions about whether or not we were doing right by the land with how we were operating our agricultural systems and our wildlife management systems. And Aldo Leopold, as a young man, had participated in some of these predator eradication programs. And in one of his more famous essays, he talked about how, as a young man, he was eager to shoot wolves in order to reduce the wolf population and help the deer population. But later, as he came to understand the complexity of the ecosystem more, he began to have doubts about whether it had been the right thing to do in eradicating large carnivores. And this is a direct quote from his famous essay. I think it's worth reading here. I thought that because fewer wolves meant more deer, that no wolves would mean hunter's paradise. But I sensed that neither the wolf nor the mountain agreed with such a view. This deep, introspective reflection really summarizes Aldo Leopold and his mark, again, on modern wildlife management. He later became a big advocate for trying to bring back wolves to places where they had been eradicated, including national parks. He was often quoted as being one of the loudest voices for suggesting that wolves be reintroduced into places like Yellowstone, where wolves had been eradicated by the Park Service. They had been shot and trapped and killed, just like they had been everywhere else. And Aldo Leopold really stood up for wolves. He was from the Northwest, from the Great Lakes states, where they still had some wolves. And he, again, really appreciated just the importance of having these carnivores on the landscape without actually having scientific information to justify why they were valuable on the landscape. At the same time, Adolph Murray was working for the U.S. National Park Service up in what is today Denali National Park, but was then called Mount McKinley National Park. And he spent a decade in the 1930s publishing what is widely recognized to be the first scientific field study on wolves. And you can still buy this book today. I've got a copy of it. The Wolves of Mount McKinley, which was published in 1944, is a very thorough field study, again, through observations over about 9 years out in the Denali Wilderness area, where he watched and observed wolves for the first time in the wild, scientifically analyzing how they behaved as family groups. He described, to the shock of himself as well as to everyone else, that packs didn't seem to be gangs of wolves that were deliriously running across the landscape, wreaking havoc on everything, but they were actually family units working together. And he was able to observe their predation patterns on caribou and on moose and on Dall sheep. And all of this really was groundbreaking. It was the pioneering project which began to show us how much we didn't know about wolves and how much we had assumed incorrectly about wolves and wolf behavior. Then moving into the 1960s and the 1970s, L. David Meach, who is still alive today and active, is basically considered the godfather of wolf biology. He published his famous book, The Wolf, in 1970, which was quantitatively the first most diverse textbook on wolf ecology and biology. Up until this point, nothing had really been published scientifically regarding the social dynamics and behavior and biology of wolves. And this book is still in print today. It's a fascinating, again, groundbreaking synopsis of everything that David Meach had discovered while working in the Midwest on different wolf projects. Most famously, he became associated with the research that was begun by Dernwood Allen on Isle Royale National Park. And I've got a slide about that, so I'll talk about that in just a minute. Here he's squatting in front of a bunch of moose jaw bones that he's taken to analyze to understand the age and the health of the moose that were killed by wolves. And so he's collecting those in order to understand the predation patterns of wolves. David Meach, as I mentioned, is still alive today. He's worked for the U.S. Geological Survey as well as the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the University of Minnesota. He has more fieldwork experience and knowledge about wolves than anyone else alive today. And he's still actively engaged in wolf conservation and research, and still is publishing books. He just published a book this year called The Wolves of Ellesmere Island and his research up in the Arctic. These individuals who I just pointed out are just some of the many, many people who have really changed the public perception of wolves through scientific advancement and understanding. But I thought it was worthwhile to give a quick snapshot of each of these individuals because it's, I believe, their seminal attitudes as well as their publications, which began to steer the course of public sentiment towards a better understanding and therefore a better appreciation and tolerance of wolves on the landscape. And as public sentiments changed, as they began to evolve, the politics surrounding these species also began to change. Never Cry Wolf by Farley Mowat is a book that was published in 1963, I believe. It's semi-fictional, semi-nonfiction. It's criticized by many wolf biologists, but this book, which later became a movie made by Disney in 1980, was groundbreaking for its sentimental value towards wolves. Many of you may have seen the movie from the 1980s or read the book even. I encourage you to read it. Again, as a wolf biologist, a lot of it is make-believe. Not all of it is accurate biology that is described in the book. But it's a pretty fun read, and it has, like I said, tremendous sentimental value, and it was a blockbuster book. It sold a lot of copies, and people really began to gravitate towards wolves as a species that had been, and still is, but had been misunderstood for a very long time. And it exposed the amount of ignorance that modern communities had surrounding the wolf. And it was stuff like this that ultimately helped to get wolves listed as an endangered species in 1974 in the lower 48 states. The Endangered Species Act was created by the Nixon administration. And so from the 1960s, the 1970s, and the 1980s, public sentiments changed because scientific inquiry had initiated a model of questioning the status quo. Do we actually understand wolves? Do we know what they're good for and how they're benefiting the environment? Are they actually monsters that need to be eradicated? Is the world a better place when we eradicate them? And all of these early pioneers, again, started to bring out the ignorance of the system that we had in place surrounding this tremendously complex species. It was because of conversations like this that we began to decide, hey, maybe we should bring wolves back to the lower 48 states, to places where they have been eradicated. Let's bring them back and put them in places where they can thrive and they can exist. And as wolves were listed as an endangered species in 1974, conversations about bringing them back and helping them recover in the lower 48 states were underway almost immediately. But wolves were still controversial. That has never not been the case, except for when perhaps everyone thought that wolves were wicked and terrible. And so deciding how and when and where wolves would be reintroduced to parts of their historical range in the lower 48 states was a very complex process. And I think I gave a webinar to NatHab on this whole process. So I'm greatly oversimplifying the reintroduction efforts of the 1990s here. That being said, it's important to understand that the Northern Rocky Mountain reintroduction of gray wolves effort took place by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in conjunction with the National Park Service and the Nez Perce tribe in 1995 and in 1996. This took place through, again, the collaborative efforts of different agencies. They went up to Canada and collected a total of 66 wolves from Alberta and British Columbia over 2 years. And they collared these individuals, and 35 were released into central Idaho, and 31 wolves were released into Yellowstone National Park. Most people are only aware of the Yellowstone story. They don't realize that it was a part of a larger program to bring wolves throughout all of the Northern Rockies. And most people also don't realize that in the 1980s, as we were making plans to reintroduce wolves into the Northern Rocky Mountain states, wolves naturally began to recolonize in parts of northwestern Montana around Glacier National Park. And the reintroduction, again, of wolves in the 90s took place in the middle of Idaho and in Yellowstone National Park. And from these translocation and natural recolonization efforts, the wolf population has grown substantially. And through natural population growth, wolves have dispersed into neighboring states and now occupy the Pacific Northwest, such as Oregon and Washington. And we have had wolves continue to disperse into other places in the country. This gives you kind of a rough estimate of what our wolf population looks like now in the lower 48 states. Across the northwestern states, we have approximately 3,200 wolves. The wolves that were never completely eradicated in Minnesota, their population and their range expanded, and they actually have more wolves in the Great Lakes states than we do out here in the northwestern states. Wolves have been moving into California. They have now 6 or 7 wolf packs in that state. 2 years ago, we began reintroducing wolves into Colorado. I have a webinar on that. And we also reintroduced wolves into the Southwest in 1999, the subspecies, the Mexican gray wolf, or Canis lupus bailey. So in the last 50 years, things have turned around. Most of these efforts to reintroduce wolves and bring them back from the threshold of regional extinction was again due to pioneering efforts in science to get the ball rolling, and also a shift in sentimental values towards the wolf. But beyond those sentimental values and those rather rudimentary understandings of wolf biology and ecology, most of these reintroduction and recovery efforts were done out of a moral obligation to try and help the ecosystem without having a really thorough and complex understanding of how wolves were important to the ecosystem. The understanding of how wolves are important to the ecosystem and why they're important to the ecosystem is a result of these reintroduction efforts and these recovery efforts. I am, again, mostly presenting here about North America, but it should be known to you as audience members that this wolf recovery uh, cultural, societal, natural history shift that we've seen in North America is not just happening in North America. We have seen in the same period of time, from the 60s, 70s up until present, many wolf populations all across Europe begin to recover. In fact, Europe, which has half the land mass of the United States, has twice as many wolves as the United States. Many of these European countries had completely eradicated their wolf populations centuries ago. But in recent decades, due to protections through the European Union, similar to the Endangered Species Act protections, wolves have slowly and steadily migrated across the landscape and naturally recolonized parts of around the Mediterranean, around Rome and Greece, all the way up into Spain and Portugal, Scandinavia, Poland, Germany, Denmark, etc. So this is kind of a current map showing you where wolf populations are settling in Europe. And the complications of coexistence in Europe are just as many and numerous and nuanced as they are over here in North America. Very often we're talking to biologists over in Europe and having conferences with them, trying to figure out what the best ways to coexist with wolves are. But pretty fascinating as wolves all across the Northern Hemisphere are making a comeback. But this is challenging because in the last several decades, or at least the last couple of centuries, the landscapes that wolves used to live on, they used to haunt on, have greatly changed. And so as they're coming back, we're asking some of the most basic questions about wolf ecology and behavior. Primarily, how do wolves interact with their environment? People know that wolves are predators, but what does that mean? Everyone wants to know, well, how many deer or elk do wolves eat? And how do they impact their prey population and the abundance of prey on the landscape? To answer these questions, the Isle Royale National Park predator-prey study between wolves and moose was initiated in the 1960s. Isle Royale is an island, a rather narrow, smallish island in Lake Superior. Um, on this island, wolves naturally crossed an ice bridge in the 1940s from Canada and Minnesota and came onto the island. The island basically only supports moose, which are very abundant, and wolves, which, due to the smallness of the island, are limited in number. But it was this Isle Royale predator prey project that David Meach led as a graduate student and is still an ongoing research project today. In fact, it's the longest ongoing predator prey study in the world. And we have learned a lot of information about how wolves engage with moose and also how moose engage with wolves and how the forest and the vegetation are all tied together with the climate. And this has created a very complex and rich understanding of the importance of predators on the landscape. But even more so, I would argue, our understanding has increased due to Yellowstone National Park. Everyone focuses on Yellowstone. It's the world's first national park. It's a beautiful area. It's an area where I grew up, so I'm particularly fond of it. I also worked in Yellowstone, researching wolves for a number of years. I'm going there this weekend to do some wolf work, actually. But wolves are surprisingly conspicuous on the Yellowstone landscape. Wolves were reintroduced into Yellowstone in 1995 and in 1996, but no one, not even the biologists, perhaps least of all the biologists, had any idea just how visible wolves would be in Yellowstone National Park. Most of the wolf population in Yellowstone, or at least a good chunk of it, lives in the northern part of the park, where it's a large montane valley, and there is a road bisecting that valley. And because of this road and because of the openness of the landscape, scientists and the public have been able to watch and observe wolves for the last 30 years in great detail. Whereas everywhere else that wolves have been studied is typically a thick coniferous forest. Visibility is nil, or at best you get in a small plane and you fly around and you look to hopefully see wolves through the timber. In Yellowstone, wolves are indisputably the most visible of any wolf population on Earth. And because of this visibility, we have been able to answer questions about wolves and their behavior that we haven't been able to answer anywhere else. Again, I'm running out of time here, so I'm going to have to fly through some of these slides. Some of the things that we have come to appreciate the most through these studies, but also again from other researchers across the globe, is understanding the predation patterns of wolves. Oftentimes the public oversimplifies predator-prey relationships. They think it's a balance, or they think at worst that predators will outweigh the prey and prey populations will be depleted when predators are on the landscape. But this totally ignores a few very important components of predator-prey relations, which have become very obvious through our research in Yellowstone. One is just how great the hunting risks are for predators. Wolves are very often killed by their prey. Their prey are much larger than themselves. We also are able to observe the awkwardness of wolf predation behavior. They're clumsy, they struggle when they hunt. It's true that they're impressive, but they're not super predators, and they have a very hard time getting their dinners. And very often the prey succeed in driving the wolves away or injuring or even killing the wolves. This has revolutionized our understanding of just, again, how complex the predator-prey relationships are. And it's helped us to develop a deeper understanding of what we call an evolutionary arms race, where if the predators really were that good at killing the prey all the time, then the prey would go extinct. They would have vanished a long time ago. But flipping the coin over, the prey also cannot always get away from the predators. There has to be some kind of oscillation going back and forth between this give and take, where wolves win some days and the elk win other days. We've also come to appreciate just how complex the variables are which influence predation rates. It's again not just a balance between predators and prey. Questions that need to be asked are how many predators are on the landscape? What is the density? What is the prey density? Are there multiple predators in the system? Are there multiple prey species in the system? What is the predator's behavior? What is the prey's behavior? What is the topographical variability? How is the landscape influencing predation? What is the temporal variability? What is the spatial variability? Are there disease components in the predator or prey populations? How old are the predator and prey species? Is it a younger population, an older population? What's the male to female ratio? How large are they? What are the winters like? Is there drought? And is there human disturbance in the equation? And this list goes on and on and on. But why I think it's so important is because as we've come to understand just how complex predator-prey relationships are, we have to think outside of the stereotypical norm of, oh, wolves eat deer, deer are impacted directly by wolves, and deer will go away because there are wolves on the landscape. Or simplistically just saying it's a balance, and deer will always remain the same stagnant number, wolves will remain the same stagnant number as they reach carrying capacity, and everything will be hunky-dory. That's not the case. Things are quite complex, and they're always changing. There's always an oscillating variability in the ecosystem. Likewise, in Yellowstone and in places like Ellesmere Island, we've learned how biparental care is so important to wolves, that wolves need one another. They evolved as a cooperative breeding species. And this has truly been fascinating for my own research. My own studies are mostly on wolf social behavior. Um, cool stuff that we didn't appreciate before. We also have come to understand just how challenging it is for a wolf to live. Most wolves only live to 2 to 5 years of age before they die. They have a very short-lived, fast-paced life history. It's tough being a wolf. Again, something that we didn't truly appreciate before. We also have come to understand that as prey diversity and predator diversity increases, you have more biodiversity on the landscape. So by incorporating or returning wolves to the landscape, we see not just a reaction, an immediate reaction through the interaction of predators and their prey, wolves and deer or elk, but we also see the entire ecosystem begin to shift, not just between predators and prey, but also between predators and other predators, other large carnivores or mesocarnivores on the landscape. Now, one of the popularly celebrated scientific discoveries from wolves returning to landscapes has to do with trophic cascades, which is this idea that predators influence their prey, which influence the vegetation. And it's been often oversimplified that wolves coming back to Yellowstone have saved the ecosystem. They've changed everything. And even groups like like National Geographic and New York Times and other popular mediums of information have celebrated this story. However, it's not quite scientifically accurate. This doesn't really get held up to snuff. And I've given a long presentation on this for NatHab before that you can look up. I'm out of time here. I'm trying to think of how I can say this succinctly. But wolves definitely have an impact on their environment. They have a beneficial impact on their environment, but it's probably not as tremendous of an impact as many people have been led to believe. And in fact, more importantly than having wolves on the landscape is having a complex suite of carnivores, a full matrix of carnivores on the landscape working together in order to ensure that the components of the ecosystem are working together. Wolves are very important, and having them come back on the landscape is a step in the right direction. But they're not going to solve all of the ecosystem's problems. They are a key component, but so are mountain lions and bears and coyotes and weasels and hawks and eagles, and to some degree humans too, if they're behaving appropriately. So this is, again, important to understand that as we continue to delve into the science of wolves and appreciating just how fascinating they are, one of the greatest discoveries we've uncovered is that large carnivores, not just wolves, but large carnivores, help to maintain an ecosystem's integrity. And as wolves make a comeback, we have to, again, appreciate and understand that the ecosystems that they once thrived in have, in many cases, been completely overturned. And we won't have wolves in abundance behaving like they used to behave in places where they used to live. That's just the reality of the now and the future. And as human populations increase and our livestock distribution on the landscape increases and our prey populations decrease, we have to ask ourselves, how are we going to move forward with coexisting with wolves? And one of the greatest challenges that many of us who are in wolf biology are working on today is how to resolve social complexities of coexistence. No longer are we focusing so much of our attention at groundbreaking research regarding the biology of wolves and their behavior. Now, many of us are working to look at the social dynamics. How do we gain tolerance with diverse stakeholders and invested peoples of different backgrounds? And how do we reduce conflicts with livestock, for example? Unless we have data, human tolerance for wolves will be elusive. And ultimately, today, we're still working at discovering and uncovering various bits of information about wolf ecology and behavior. We've come a long ways in the last 100 years. 100 years ago, we were systematically trying to kill all wolves. We were removing them from the landscape. There certainly are a lot of challenges today. People still hate wolves in many places. But the fact that we're now having conversations and we're doing research on how to coexist with them rather than how to simply eradicate them is a pretty impressive 180. And I thank you all for tuning in. I'm right at the top of the hour. Sorry it was a bit rushed at the end there, but I've got time for Q&A if anyone has questions.
All right, Aaron, thank you so much. So before we dive into the questions, I would like to remind everyone that you can submit your questions via the question field in your control panel. We do have plenty of them, so let's get to them while we still have some time here. So are wolves still actively being reintroduced into certain areas right now?
Yes, in the state of Colorado. Um, In 2020, the state of Colorado, and this is unique because it was a state-led initiative, not a federal government initiative, but the state of Colorado voted to reintroduce wolves into the state. I gave a whole webinar on that movement, and for the next couple of years at least, wolves will be reintroduced into that state. In 2023, what year are we in? 25? And at the end of 2023, wolves were taken from the state of Oregon and were reintroduced into Colorado to help grow that population. Then this last year in 2024, 2025, wolves were captured in British Columbia and reintroduced into Colorado. And they'll continue to reintroduce wolves for at least the next 2 years. But other than that, most efforts are natural recolonization. So wolves dispersing on their own to fill in those void places on the map.
Is there a danger to the wolves when they're sedated? And how heavy was that wolf you carried?
There's no greater danger than if you were to be anesthetized. So it's the drug that we use specifically for wolves is called tilazol, which is a common drug that a lot of domestic dog veterinarians use. The animal falls asleep within usually 5 minutes of the injection, and then they metabolize the drug. They wake up about 90 minutes later and get up and walk away. They're drunk as a skunk. They're just like when you wake up from being anesthetized. You're dizzy, but they come right out of it and are just fine. That wolf that I was carrying was about just over 70 pounds, I think around 75 pounds or so.
Do we know what criteria is used to pick the wolves for moving?
Yes. So again, most reintroduction efforts, like the ones in Yellowstone and central Idaho, we tried to select for packs or individuals that would be cohesive in a pack. Most reintroduction efforts take place right before breeding season. So you're generally collecting yearlings. So in wolf biology, you have mom and dad, and then you have you have offspring that are college age offspring if you're going to create a parallel to humans. So they're the age where they're about to leave mom and dad, go off on their own and try and find a mate and start their own family. So that's the age group that we're typically selected for reintroductions. You're looking for the ones that are going to be leaving their own pack, their family pack anyway, and they're sexually mature, they've gone through puberty, but they don't have kids of their own, they don't have a mate, And so you're selecting those individuals and you're bringing them onto the landscape right before breeding season, which takes place in mid-February around here at this latitude. And you hope that they meet up. It's kind of like a dating shuffle.
At what age do wolves reach sexual maturity, since they do have such a short lifespan?
Around 22 months. Around 22 months is typically when wolves go through puberty. So just before they're 2 years old.
And do wolves have more than one litter per year?
They only have one litter per year. They're born 63 days ish after insemination. So they have a 63-day gestation period. So at this latitude, they are mating in the middle of February, and then the pups are born in the middle of April. About 6 pups are typically born in a litter, but usually only 2 or 3 survive to the end of the year. And that's just because it's really tough being a newborn baby animal, not just for wolves, but any species.
So do we know why the red wolf population has not expanded?
Yeah, so red wolves are actually a different species than Canis lupus. Canis rufus is what we call them scientifically, and they are endemic to North America, to the southeastern states actually. So they are only found in that part of the world, and they are arguably more closely related to coyotes, which are also endemic to North America. Their population has crashed and they are highly endangered um, because of predator eradication programs, but also because they have hybridized with coyotes to the point that genome, their genomic integrity is in question. So there's not a lot of wild public lands where they are living in the Carolinas. We're trying to reintroduce from captive populations. We're bringing red wolves into that population. So there's another reintroduction effort. Captive wolves, putting them into the wild, and it's just not going well because human tolerance for them is poor, but also the habitat and the environment is poor, and genetically they're in trouble. So
Eh, So do European wolves and the red wolves in North Carolina show similar social behaviors?
well, they're still canines, and so yeah, they have a lot of same general behavioral patterns. Like they live in packs, they raise their offspring together, but the wolves in Europe are Canis lupus, whereas the red wolves are Canis rufus. So it's a different species. But our wolves in Yellowstone, in Colorado, in Alaska, in New Mexico, those are all the same species as the wolves that you find in Scandinavia and in Italy. It's all Canis lupus over there. But yeah, a lot of the same behavioral patterns. In fact, they can hybridize too. All members of the Canis genus can hybridize. So wolves can hybridize with coyotes, theoretically. It's happened in the eastern states on a couple of occasions, but in the western part of the continent, um, there's no hybridization documented in our wolf population. And we know that through DNA sampling when we run DNA tests. Wolves and coyotes generally don't get along.
Aha, good to know. Thank you. So do you have any encounter that stands out to you with a wild wolf that you'd like to share with us?
Um, I I mean, I have a couple. They're short, but I'll just quickly say them. I grew up outside of Yellowstone. I was 5 years old when they were reintroduced, but I didn't see my first wild wolf until I was 15. I was working at the time in the back country of Yellowstone, and I was not anywhere near a road. I was clear out in the wild, and I saw my first wolf. And I have seen hundreds and hundreds of wolves since then, but that first wolf interaction was pretty impressive. It definitely stuck with me. So it's not an exciting story, but it really changed everything for me. And another encounter is as a young graduate student, I was studying wolves in the same area, actually, which is maybe why it it stands out to me. But I was in the backcountry of Yellowstone and was studying a wolf pack when suddenly I had a large bull elk come tearing through the brush just a couple of feet from me with a wolf hot on its tail. I don't think the wolf was successful in catching the elk, but to be out there looking for wolves and then to have a wolf and an elk come crashing in upon you was thrilling, and I'll never forget that.
Thank you for sharing that, Aaron. We appreciate that. So, how dire is the plight of wolves and wolf conservation at this point in time?
It's not dire. I wouldn't use the word dire to describe it. It's wolves are a hot button for everyone. I think that one of the biggest benefits to wolf conservation is the biology of the animal. They're very tenacious. If they were more sensitive to climate change, if they were more sensitive to poaching and to humans killing wolves, um, if they were more sensitive to disease, we would be in a pickle because we have, since reintroducing them, we've mismanaged them a lot. They've lost a lot of habitat. People poach them all the time. People hate them. People are shooting them all the time. But wolves as a species are incredibly resilient. They are one of the species that perhaps has the least concern for climate change issues because they're so adaptive on the landscape. And despite people hunting them excessively in some places and poaching them, um, they're pretty prolific. So they're a little bit like rabbits. They're like bunny rabbits. They reproduce pretty quickly. They're adaptive, and it's concerning how much hate they get. But I would be more concerned if they weren't biologically resilient. That doesn't mean that we don't have concerns. We do have concerns. We hope that they'll continue to be managed appropriately where they are being managed appropriately, and we hope that management will improve where their management is in question. But biologically, they're a pretty hardy species. There are other species which are of a much more pressing concern.
Thank you for that answer, Aaron. Unfortunately, that will be the last question that we do have time for today. So I'd like to hand it back to you for your closing comments.
Thanks, everyone. Again, I wish that I could continue to engage with you all. Your questions are so fascinating. I would love to meet you all in person. Thank you for hearing me out on my presentation today. And good luck out there. Stay curious, and thanks again.
Aaron, thank you so much for taking the time to present for us today. And I'd also like to thank everyone who joined us today. So if you are interested in information on how you can travel with NatHab, please give us a call at the number on your screen, or you can send us an email at info@nathab.com. Our adventure specialists are happy to help you out. Join us tomorrow for our next Daily Dose of Nature. You can check out this week's lineup, including registration links, on our website at nathab.com/webinars. We did record today's presentation, and we will have the replay available on our website soon. With that, I will conclude the webinar. Goodbye, everybody. We'll see you next time.